The scale was there before she was. It sat on the cold tile floor of a small room at the back of the studio lot, tucked between the costume department and the makeup corridor, where the hallway smelled like powder and cigarette smoke and something synthetic that had no name. The room had no window, one overhead bulb, a wooden chair pushed against the wall that no one ever sat in, and the scale, white enamel with a red needle, waiting every morning for the same thing. She arrived at 6, not because she wanted to, not because she had chosen to. Her contract required it. The clause was buried 14 pages in, between the morality provision and the language prohibiting marriage without studio consent. It read, in the language of a legal document, that the studio retained the right to monitor the physical
Eleanor, a word
condition
of
of its
advice about your
contract
body.
players at
Yes?
regular
It's affecting your
intervals as
performance.
determined
It
by the
needs to
studio's
change.
discretion. What that meant in practice was a scale and a red needle and a number that would determine whether she worked that day. This is not a story about vanity. She was not vain about her figure in the way the magazine suggested. She was afraid of a number. There is a difference, and it matters. Before number 10, subscribe. This channel exists to make exactly this kind of film. Hit that button, then let's go. In 1950, the major studios, MGM, Paramount, Columbia, Warner Brothers, Universal, maintained what the industry called personal service contracts. These were not employment agreements in the ordinary sense. They were documents of control, comprehensive and detailed, covering not only what a woman could perform, but what she could weigh, how she could wear her hair, whom she could be seen with in public, and whether she was permitted to alter her appearance without written studio approval. The contracts ran 7 years. Options renewed annually, always at the studio's discretion, never the actress's. She could not leave. She could not negotiate. She could be loaned to another studio without her consent, the way a piece of equipment might be transferred between departments. And she could be placed on suspension without pay for any violation the studio chose to classify as a violation. The wait clause was standard by 1945. It appeared in contracts for leading ladies, supporting players, and contract starlets who had never yet appeared on screen. It was not negotiated. It was presented. The number written into the contract was determined not by a physician, but by the studio's idea of what a woman should look like under studio lighting, which in the 1940s was harsh and unforgiving, and added what the cameraman privately called 10 visible pounds to anyone who stood in front of it. She signed because the alternative was not working at all. Everyone understood this. Nobody said it out loud. Eleanor Parker arrived at Columbia in 1941 on a standard contract. She was 20 years old and had come from Ohio with nothing but a drama teacher's recommendation and the particular kind of beauty that photographed well in black and white. She did not think of herself as a movie star. She thought of herself as someone who needed work, and Columbia had offered it. The morning weigh-in was explained to her by a studio secretary on her
Eleanor,
second
a
day,
word of
as
advice
though
about
it
your
were a
body.
scheduling matter.
Yes?
It's
Something
affecting
between
your
the hair
performance.
appointment
It
and the
needs to
costume
change.
fitting. She would report to the wardrobe building by 6:30. The studio doctor would be present on Mondays. On other days, a studio administrator would record the number. The number would be filed. If the number moved in the wrong direction, she would be notified. She was notified several times over the following years. What notification looked like was a quiet conversation with a man behind a desk who did not look at her directly and who suggested that she might want to be more careful. Careful was the word he used, as though her body were a piece of glassware she was handling incorrectly. She was not alone in this room. Every woman on the lot reported to it. Some of them had been reporting to rooms like it for a decade. What the studios understood, and what took decades for anyone outside them to articulate clearly, was that control of the body was control of the person. It was not incidental. It was structural. A woman who feared the scale every morning was a woman whose attention was already partially occupied before she arrived on set. She was calculating. She was measuring. She was managing something invisible that the audience would never see and that the cameras would never catch. The performance the audience watched was built on top of a different private performance that had been running since 6 o'clock and had nothing to do with the script. Stay with this part because what happened in that room shaped everything that came after it. The number on the scale was not the only mechanism. It was the most visible one. Around it had grown an entire private infrastructure of management, the diet doctors who maintained discreet practices in Beverly Hills, and who were known in the industry not by reputation, but by referral, The pharmaceutical solutions that were described in studio correspondence not as drugs but as assistants. The food restrictions that were communicated not by a medical professional but by a production manager with a clipboard. And the silence that surrounded all of it, which was comprehensive and deliberate, and enforced not by threat but by the simple understanding that a woman who spoke about these things publicly would not work again. The silence was the architecture. Everything else was built inside it. The diet doctor's office on Wilshire Boulevard had a waiting room with good chairs and a receptionist who recognized every face and never acknowledged recognizing any
Eleanor,
of them.
a word of
The
advice
doctor
about your
himself
body.
had studied medicine in
It's
the
affecting
East
your
and
performance.
had come to
It
Los
needs to
Angeles
change.
in 1938 with a general practice that had, by the early 1950s, become something considerably more specialized. He prescribed what was called at the time a reducing regimen. The term was clinical and precise and communicated nothing about what the regimen actually contained. Amphetamines had been commercially available in the United States since 1937. By 1945, they were being manufactured in quantities sufficient for the entire American military and were beginning to move into civilian use. By the early 1950s, they were the quiet foundation of a significant portion of Hollywood's weight management industry. She took what the doctor gave her because the studio had sent her to him, and because the alternative was the number on the scale moving in the wrong direction and what came after that. She did not ask what was in the prescription. The doctor did not explain. There was a professional understanding between them that asking and explaining were both beside the point. What the amphetamine did was suppress hunger completely and replace it with a particular kind of electric wakefulness that she learned to work inside of, to perform inside of, to smile inside of. The camera loved what it did to her eyes. Nobody on set commented on her eyes. They commented on how well she was looking. This is not a story about weakness. She was not weak. She was navigating a system that had been designed to require exactly what she was doing, and she was doing it with the same professionalism she brought to every other requirement in the contract. Rita Hayworth did not choose her hairline. In 1941, Harry Cohn at Columbia decided that Hayworth's natural hairline was too low for the image he intended to build around her. The solution was electrolysis, performed over several sessions, that permanently altered the shape of her hairline. The procedure was presented as a requirement of her contract, or more precisely as the kind of decision that simply happened to women at studios. The way lighting decisions happened or costume decisions happened. She had no meaningful right of refusal. The photographs that followed, the ones that made her face one of the most recognizable in the world, the ones pinned to the walls of soldiers' barracks during the war, the ones studied and reproduced and written about
Eleanor,
for 80
a word
years
of
since,
advice about your body.
documented the results of a
It's
procedure
affecting
she
your
did not
performance.
choose,
It needs to change.
applied to a face the studio had decided to modify, presented to the public as simply and naturally her. What Hayworth thought about it privately is not well documented. What is documented is that she continued working. She continued arriving at 6. She continued standing in front of the camera and giving it what it needed. She was a professional, which in that system meant she had learned to absorb what the system required without allowing it to show. The photograph, in other words, was always the end of the story. Everything before it was the part that didn't make the frame. The marriage prohibition clause appeared in contracts throughout the studio era. At some studios it was absolute. She could not marry without written permission. At others it was conditional. She could marry, but the studio retained approval over the timing, the announcement, and the public presentation of the relationship, because the studio's investment in her image was a financial interest, and a married woman photographed differently than an unmarried one in fan magazines, and fan magazines were how audiences decided whether to buy a ticket. She was permitted to have a private life. She was not permitted to have one that the studio could not manage. The distinction was maintained through a system of publicists, columnists, photographers, and arrangements, the word used in industry correspondence, that directed the public narrative around every contract player's personal existence. The gossip columns were not independent. Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper were not operating outside the studio system. They were inside it, and the information they published was controlled selectively by the studios in exchange for the access that made their columns possible. A story that appeared in Luella Parsons' column was a story that someone at a studio had decided should appear. And a story that never appeared was a story that someone had decided should not. This is where it becomes difficult to separate what was hidden from what simply wasn't visible. The two are not the same thing. Hidden implies effort. Much of what women in that system experienced was simply not a story anyone at the time was telling. The women who went home from the scale to the makeup chair to the set to the fan magazine to the premiere to the scale again were not unhappy in any simple way. This is important to say clearly. The photographs show women who were doing something
Eleanor, a
genuinely
word of advice
extraordinary,
about your body.
performing at a
Yes?
level
It's
that
affecting your
required
performance.
intelligence
It
and
needs to
discipline
change.
and a particular kind of emotional precision that training could develop but not create. They were proud of their work, many of them. They loved parts of it. The lights coming up, the scene finding its footing, the dailies going well. What they were managing, behind and beneath and around all of that, was a system of requirements that had no language for itself, because the language would have made it visible, and visibility would have made it a problem, and making it a problem was not something the system permitted. Some of them understood this with great clarity. Some of them did not understand it at all and simply experienced its effects as something about themselves, a personal failure of control, a weakness in their relationship to their own body, something that they needed to manage more efficiently. The system was most effective on the women in the second category. It asked nothing of them except compliance, and it gave them, in return, nothing except the sense that they were insufficient at something they should have been able to manage alone. The scale was there before they arrived. It was there when they left. It kept its number in a file, and the file went into a cabinet, and the cabinet sat in a room on the studio lot that no audience member ever saw and no photograph ever captured. It was just a room, a bulb, a chair no one sat in, and a red needle that decided something. The studio system collapsed between 1948 and 1960. A series of antitrust decisions forced the studios to divest their theater holdings, which broke the vertical integration that had made the contract system economically necessary. Television drew audiences away from cinemas. The guaranteed audience that had made contract players valuable began to erode. By 1960, the personal service contract as the major studios had operated it was largely over. The actresses who had spent years inside the system moved into a different industry, one that operated differently and required different things. Some of them found it freer. Some of them found that they had been shaped by the previous system in ways they were still discovering. The scale in the back room of the studio lot was eventually removed. The room became something else. A storage space, probably. A place for equipment or costumes or paperwork. Nobody
Eleanor, a
photographed
word
it
of
on its
advice
last
about your
day.
body.
Nobody marked
Yes?
the occasion.
It's affecting
It was
your
simply a
performance.
room that
It needs
stopped
to
being
change.
used for one thing and became a room that was used for something else. What it had taken from the women who stood in it every morning, the attention, the calculation, the quiet, sustained effort of managing a number before the day had started, that did not go with it. That had gone somewhere else a long time ago. There is a photograph of Ava Gardner taken on the Paramount lot in 1953 by a studio photographer whose name nobody now remembers. She is standing in a hallway between setups in costume. She has a cigarette in one hand. She is looking slightly to the left of the camera, not at it, which means this is not a posed photograph. Her posture is the posture of someone between things, waiting, resting between efforts. She looks exactly like herself, which is to say she looks like nothing the studio publicity department would have chosen to release, because the studio publicity department released photographs of her looking at the camera, arranged and lit and deliberately presented. This photograph is something else. This is the hallway. This is the moment before the performance resumed. She would have gone to the scale that morning. She would have had a number recorded. She would have crossed the lot to the makeup chair and sat there for an hour, and then crossed to the set and stood in front of the lights and done the work the contract required. All of that is in the photograph somewhere, in the cigarette, in the gaze that isn't quite meeting the camera, in the particular kind of stillness that belongs to someone who has been performing since 6 o'clock and who knows there are several hours left. She was one of the most photographed women in the world at that moment. The most widely reproduced images of her face were images of a face that had been prepared, approved, lit, and directed by people who had financial interests in the result. This photograph in the hallway was not one of those images. This was just Tuesday. The photographs we kept are the ones the studios chose. The Tuesday photographs mostly didn't survive, or were never printed, or were filed and forgotten. What we have is the performance. What we don't have mostly is the hallway. If any of this landed somewhere, if it felt like something you already half knew but hadn't quite heard said directly, subscribe. Next time we go deeper into the machinery that ran behind the glamour. A different room, a different kind of contract. I'll see you there.